Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Welcome to the 23rd lecture of Public Finance. We have up till now been discussing government revenues, government finance basically, which is how government actually generates revenue for its different activities. Different activities would include various public goods, various public services, provision of like national defense or construction of roads, and then also it also includes how government generates its revenues for providing support to poor or elderly in terms of income support programs or the unemployed. So all of these things affect the economies a lot, and in next few lectures we would be discussing those effects also. In the last lecture we started basically the concept of government finance, and we are still introducing that concept step by step. Now in the last lecture actually what we discussed was that how do we lay down the criteria to evaluate various government finance programs. Either they may be taxation, they may be inflationary finance, they may be through issuance of debt like bonds. So we were establishing a criteria through which we can evaluate various programs of government finance. And so that criteria was equity, efficiency, and administrative ease. Now let us consider it from the perspective of taxation only. What would be equity? Now equity was debated before this we came to this point, that it was either taxation can be on the benefits principle, that whoever derives more benefits from the use of the product or government service or a government good, then he should be taxed according to that. And the second criteria was on the basis of ability to pay of an individual. Ability to pay would be that how much, what would be his economic ability to pay, and we discussed horizontal equity and vertical equity in that sense. Horizontal equity would be that individuals having an equal economic standing should be paying the equal level, and individuals in terms of vertical equity we discussed that individuals with higher ability to pay, with better economic ability, they should be paying more. And so that vertical equity is established based on certain norm of fairness in which certain individuals who are above in the higher tax brackets are expected to pay higher levels of taxes just because they are able to pay that. We had a debate over here in terms of equity, in terms of horizontal as well as vertical equity, whether they are actually fair or not, but then we left the question open because there are certain things in this perspective that cannot be resolved that easily. Then we discussed the efficiency criteria, because government actions actually might affect the efficiency in the market outcomes. And we had an example of a tax, specifically gasoline tax, in which the equilibrium outcome was distorted because of that government tax. And we discussed this efficiency disturbance due to government actions in great detail in terms of subsidies also, in terms of many other government programs. So even in terms of taking up the government projects, we discussed that efficiency might be one of the prime criteria for evaluating those projects. Then we discussed the administrative ease, because government laws and for specifically in terms of taxation needs to be implemented, and if they are simple and if they are clear, and if the tax methodology of taxation is easy, then it is very easy to enforce it as well. It is simple. So if it is not very simple, then it is difficult to impose that and to ensure tax compliance. So we discussed that another criteria for evaluating government finance alternatives would be to see the administrative ease of implementing that perspective, either it is taxation or it is fees or it is maybe taxation or fees or tuition fees or licenses. So in order to see what is the best option, we need to evaluate all those programs on the basis of equity, efficiency and administrative ease. And then we also discussed that there is always a trade-off for the government in terms of equity and in terms of efficiency, because equitable taxes might not be fair to certain individuals. Equitable taxes might be fair to certain individuals, but they might not cause an efficiency. And on the other hand, efficient taxes might be unfair to many individuals. So we would be, in fact, in coming lectures I would show you an example in which the efficiency, if we focus on efficiency, then we would lose equity, and that would be treated as not fair by many individuals. Even you would agree to that also, because that would force us to tax the necessities more. It is based on elasticity of the demand curve. We would come to that later on. And then we discussed the issue of tax compliance. We discussed two concepts. One was tax evasion and the other was tax avoidance. Tax evasion is basically when an individual deliberately hides his taxable income and pays a less amount of tax. That is a tax evasion. And tax avoidance is like tax evasion is basically illegal, but tax avoidance is legal, because in terms of tax avoidance you are either delaying the payment of taxes using within certain legal umbrella, and either you are taking up certain activities which would reduce your taxable income, and that would again be legal. Then we discussed that how can we, because tax evasion is a very you can say significant cut on government revenues, and when these cuts are made, that would mean there are free riders prevailing in the economy, and those free riders are enjoying government goods and services without having to pay for them. And I explained over here is that that burden is automatically transferred to those individuals who are paying taxes. So if everybody pays taxes, then burden would be distributed equally across the board. But if some of those individuals are not paying taxes, the government has to operate, and it has to generate that revenue. So either government would go in deficit, and it might finance that deficit through printing of more money, or getting more bonds, or issuing more bonds. The debt finance concept. So all of them would also affect those individuals who are evading tax, but they do not realize it at that moment when they are doing it, in fact, and they do not realize it because that would distort the efficiency in the economy, and the burden would be on them in the longer run as well. So we considered that an individual actually evades tax up to the point where his marginal private benefit is equal to the marginal social cost. Marginal private benefit would be, in a sense, that what would be a private benefit? Benefit in terms of evading tax would be for me to, so that now I have to pay lesser amount of tax, and there is some unreported income with me that I won't be showing as taxable. And marginal social cost would be, in a sense, that because of the probability of being caught, there would be fines, and there would be legal action against me, and that would be the cost for me. So an individual who is evading taxes, he would consider up to the point where marginal private benefit is equal to the marginal social cost or marginal private cost. So in that sense, that would be the equilibrium point, and he would be evading taxes only up to that point. So what we can do is either we decrease the marginal social benefit for him. Marginal social benefit can be decreased, that with increase in units of income being unreported, it is a downward sloping curve, so benefit is reducing. So we can reduce the marginal tax rate, and while individuals get into higher brackets, their marginal benefit reduces. And on the other hand, we can also increase the marginal social cost. Marginal benefit is actually reduced because with greater the number of income, the probability of being caught increases. So you automatically evade less tax. Marginal social cost can also be increased in a sense that an individual can be, for example, if the probability of government action is very high. If the probability of government action is high, and if there is more chance of being audited, and if there is more chance of a legal action by the government in case of any tax evasion, then marginal social cost would automatically rise, and individual would automatically reduce the quantity of unreported income. So these would be certain methods through which tax evasion can be reduced. Then we also discuss certain alternative means of for the government other than the taxes through which they can finance their operations. One is like debt finance, that would be issuing bonds, and why those bonds would be sold, because people who would be buying those bonds would be considering that the opportunity cost of that sum for other activities is low. They do not have any profitable outcomes from other sources, and this sort of a bond would pay interest to them, and there is a guarantee of by the government, because they are risk free also, so their benefit from that is higher. That's why they would buy that bond, and that would provide government some resources, some funds, some capital to take up certain activities. And in that scenario also, that whenever there is a time for maturity of that bond, government might increase the taxes to pay back those bondholders, or they also might issue more bonds to pay them back. Then there is inflationary finance. Inflationary finance is when government increases the money supply to take up certain activities, and that we discussed this in the scenario of a production possibility frontier or a production possibility curve. Now we showed that if there are two products to be chosen from, product A and product B, then there is a certain point on the production possibility frontier which might be the efficient point where all the resources are being utilized efficiently. Points beyond that production possibility frontier are not attainable for any economy. So if in case of inflationary finance, if they print money, so temporarily that point becomes attainable for them, and later on it would move back to the production possibility frontier. But for that time being, if they need to increase the production of good B on the y-axis without reducing the production of good A on the x-axis, they can use inflationary finance for that given time period. Governments might use this kind of a scenario in terms of a catastrophe, a natural disaster, or maybe in times of war, when they need to produce more of certain goods for provisions of the economy. And then we also discussed there are donations, there are user charges, and then there are earmarked taxes. User-based charges are basically for when an individual uses a facility, he might be paying a charge for that, and those would be user charges. For example, you might have paid toll while getting on the motorway, so that is a user charge again. And then what would be earmarked taxes? Earmarked taxes are taxes for a certain activity. Maybe the government needs to build a bridge in your area, and they might tax that tax is for the building of that bridge. And for example, there is a flood affectee relief fund, and for that government sometimes might tax all the salaried individuals, public sector employees, to provide relief to those individuals. So there are various methods through which earmarked taxes are also applied. Now, user charges also might create efficiency in the market, and an outcome which cannot be reached without those user charges in certain cases. We discussed two examples specifically. One was in terms of trash collection, in which an individual would only pay up to the marginal private benefit, while the cost of that activity is greater. So government would subsidize that difference in terms of external benefits, and the equilibrium point and quantity would be where marginal social benefit, or which would be actually marginal private benefit plus marginal external benefit, would be equal to marginal social cost, and that would create efficiency in that market. Now, the second one we discussed was that it can also be possible to avoid excessive use of congestible public services. I hope you remember the example of a road where we consider it as a public good or a government good, and that road, because up to certain point, it's because of free flow traffic, it is fine. There are certain limits to that. When a certain number of cars, it goes beyond certain number of cars, then the roads would start to congest, and those congestions would increase the cost for individuals. And that was represented that in a sense that on the x-axis, from 0 to a certain point, there was no social cost of that, because the traffic was in free flow. But as soon as the traffic becomes congested, the marginal social cost curves or suddenly comes out of the x-axis and starts to rise. So the idea would be to to tax or to put a user charge on individuals whose marginal benefit for use of that road after the point of congestion is equal to the marginal social cost. So that would actually reduce the congestion, and that would be an optimal scenario. Then we also discussed that for government finance there are again utilities and public utilities or certain government enterprises through which they can earn revenue. Now continuing with that discussion of public finance, government finance, we also discussed that in this lecture we would be evaluating certain actions by the government in terms of taxing. Now the debate is about taxation, price efficiency and the distribution of good, which we are going to take up today. Now we would start with the concept of a lump sum tax. A lump sum tax is a fixed tax that is owed by everyone and is not subject to something taxpayer can change. So it is owed by everyone, every citizen in the country, without reference to the level of income he has and without the quantity that he consumes or the total wealth that he has. It is independent of these, and it is just a lump sum amount that is being placed as a tax, maybe on a sale of a product or maybe on your income or anything. An example is a head tax, which is constant for each and every individual despite their increases or decreases in income. So basically normal tax might create inefficiency. So that is why we need to compare the normal tax with the actions with the effects on the market by a lump sum tax. That is why we are introducing the term of a lump sum tax. Now inefficiency in taxation results from the ability to avoid taxation, but lump sum taxes are unavoidable. They serve as the benchmark by which other taxes are measured. Now the main thing over here is that the other taxes which are based on income or wealth or sales, and they can all be evaded very easily because they are related to certain quantity of income or certain quantity of good consumed or certain amount of wealth that an individual has. So with increase in income, the tax would be increased. So if an individual wants to avoid that tax, he would show his income to be less than what is taxable, and he would be hiding certain income from taxation. That is what we exactly discussed in terms of unreported income and tax evasion. But in terms of lump sum tax, since it is not associated to the level of income, or it is not associated to the quantity an individual is consuming or the size of his wealth, so it is a lump sum amount, so it is very difficult to avoid. It cannot be avoided like just other taxes and just hiding certain consumption or hiding certain unreported income. And the main thing is that these lump sum taxes has only the income effect. They do not have substitution effects like other taxes. I hope you understand the difference between income effect and substitution effect. Now income effect would be like, for example, if there is a tax on lump sum taxes on every individual, then it would automatically reduce my real income. Those are maybe, for example, an economy is overheating and it is at its peak, so government needs to control that economy. Now if they put a tax on certain type of a good, or they put a tax on for example certain levels of income at different rates of consumption maybe, so that tax would create an inefficiency in a sense that they would also result into substitution effect. In terms of income effect, only the real income is reduced, but in terms of substitution effect, people substitute towards other goods, because if, for example, one good is taxed and the other good is not, then this good is relatively more expensive for me than the other good. So I might substitute also during the process of choosing my whole market basket. So that might result into an inefficiency. We discussed those income and substitution effects when we were discussing like the retirement funds or subsidies towards unemployed individuals, and we had a discussion on substitution and income effects. I hope you can recall that discussion. Now what happens is that if we inefficiency in taxation can be used to can be evaluated based on the grounds if we assume that there is a lump sum tax, because that is an unavoidable tax and that only has an income effect. It does not have a substitution effect. So reducing what there is no price distortion in a lump sum tax, because why in the other tax there is reduction in buying power, but it also affects the marginal social benefit and marginal social cost. But a lump sum tax actually only reduces the buying power. It has only its income effect, so that is why it does not affect the point where marginal social benefit is equal to marginal social cost, and doesn't affect the attainment of efficient outcomes, of course, because of this reason. Then efficient allocation of resources with the pattern of demand originating from new demand due to new income distribution. You are just affecting the income of the individuals. You are taking a lump sum amount out of that individual's hands. So what is happening over here is that then a new equilibrium would be simply defined, and that new equilibrium would be based on the pattern of new demand that originates because of that lump sum tax. So it would be another efficient outcome. It would be another efficient allocation of resources, just a new point of equilibrium which is very efficient, rather than just an old, rather than the difference. Whenever the difference between two equilibrium points is again based on the substitution effect, then we saw in many examples that there are deadweight losses or excess burdens. But if there is a lump sum tax, there won't be any excess burden. It would just be a new equilibrium point. So what are price distorting taxes then? A price distorting tax is a tax that alters the relative price of good. Now the issue is not the income effect over here. Now it is affecting the relative price of a good. If I'm taxing one good, for example, if I'm taxing gasoline, then that would mean that now gasoline is more expensive than all the other goods, because normally when drawing indifference curves, we use one good on the x-axis while considering such a scenario, either a subsidy or a tax, and we consider rest of the goods on the y-axis, like we considered, for example, housing demand for housing on x-axis and consumption of all the other goods on y-axis. We considered medical facilities on x-axis and then all the other goods on y-axis, because we were doing indifference curve analysis, and we saw that whenever one of the good is made cheaper or expensive relative to all the other goods, it's not that all the goods are being made expensive, because if it is a lump sum tax, it would reduce my income completely. So for me, the relative expensiveness of the two goods is not disturbed. It's just my budget line that has shifted up or down. But whenever an action by the government, either a tax or a subsidy, tilts the budget line, as I explained, that it pivots on the y-axis and moves along the x-axis, then there is a substitution effect, and that substitution effect might cause inefficiency, because it changes the relative relationship in terms of price of all the goods. So now this good is either more cheap in terms of a subsidy or more expensive in terms of a tax. So a price distorting tax, just as we discussed the price distorting subsidies, a price distorting tax is a tax that alters the relative price of a good. So relative in a sense that now that good is more expensive to all the other goods. If all the goods are taxed equally, then the budget line would shift. So that won't cause inefficiencies in the system, because they would find a new point of equilibrium where marginal social benefit would be equal to marginal social cost. So those actions by the government which has an income effect, they are actually not affecting the market efficiency, but those actions, when they are having distortions in the prices, then there is a chance that there is inefficiency in the market, and let us discuss that inefficiency. Now as an example, we take prices of gasoline, for example, fuel that is used to drive cars, that would be gasoline. The budget line pivots. Now in this scenario, let us assume that the government taxes gasoline relative to all the other goods, and the purchase price for the consumers would increase for gasoline specifically, not for all the other goods, because only gasoline is being taxed. Now we would discuss this in terms of and also a scenario where there is there is a lump sum tax only. Now this is a graph of indifference curves, and there are budget lines. I hope I do not need to explain indifference curves and budget lines right now, but I would just narrate them once. On the x-axis there is consumption of an individual's gasoline per year, in terms of gallons quantity. You might use liters over here, so it's fine. Then on y-axis there is expenditure on all the other goods and services that an individual uses or consumes. An indifference curve represents represents all the combinations of these goods and services which would provide equal level of satisfaction to an individual. For example, there is an indifference curve saying U2 over here. That U2 represents the level of various combinations of goods on x-axis, which is gasoline, and all the other goods on y-axis, various combinations which would give him an equal level of satisfaction, which would be U1. That is why he is indifferent. And then there is a budget line which is represented by AB over here. We are first considering the indifference curve of U3 and the budget line AB. This is like without any price distorting tax or without any lump sum tax in any given scenario. It is just one indifference curve without any taxation and one budget line. This budget line represents all various combinations of the two goods that an individual can afford considering the amount of budget that he has. It is basically how much money he has in his pocket and various combinations of those goods that he would prefer, that he can afford. Now the point of tangency of indifference curve and budget line would be the optimal point, because that would be the least cost method of achieving that level of utility, because it is just touching the budget line at one point, the lowest possible point, because indifference curves are convex and there is a marginal rate of substitution. When an individual needs to increase the quantity of one good, in order to stay on the same utility level, he need to decrease the quantity of the other good, because the total utility would remain constant. And so is the case with the budget line. If he wants to purchase more of, for example, gasoline, he, considering his income constraint, his limitations, his total budget, he would have to let go certain quantity of all the other goods. So at first the individual is at utility level U3, and that is tangent to the budget line AB, and the point of equilibrium is represented by E over here. And at this point he is consuming Q1 quantity of gallons of gasoline and Y1 quantity of all the other goods. Now let us assume that there is a price distorting tax by the government. Now what would happen in the sense of price distorting tax? The budget line would pivot on the y-axis and move along the x-axis, because only that price distorting tax has been implemented on gasoline only. So only gasoline is expensive and not the other goods. All the other goods can be bought at the same price. You see, the point A is same, because if he does not buy gasoline, he can spend all his income on consuming all the other goods, and that would be exactly point A. Now point B has shifted, because previously if he never bought anything else, no other goods, no food, no clothing, no shelter, nothing else, he only used gasoline. So in that sense he could buy B amount of gasoline, which is represented by point B on the first budget line. But now that with the implementation of tax on gasoline, only gasoline is expensive. So with the same amount of money he can buy less amount of gasoline, but with the same amount of money he can buy the same amount of all the other goods. That's why the budget line pivots on the y-axis and it is moving along the x-axis. If it was other way around, if it was that it was all the other goods that were being for example taxed, not gasoline, so the budget line would pivot along the x-axis. That would mean point B would remain same, and the point A would shift inwards, and inward shift represents that the good is more expensive now. Because in the cases of subsidies, we consider when subsidy is given, the budget line would shift outwards, because the good is more cheaper now, you can buy more of that good with the same amount of money. But now the individual cannot buy the same amount of good, he can buy the less amount of good in case of a tax. So the budget line shift towards the origin. So the new budget line is A, B prime, and at this point, considering his utility level U1, which would be the new point of equilibrium, the individual can buy QT amount of gasoline and he can buy YT amount of all the other goods. You see, because of this price distorting tax, the individual has shifted from number one, he has shifted from U3 to U2, right? That is acceptable. And U3 to U1, sorry, U3 to U1, because of that price distorting tax. We are only considering two budget lines right now. One budget line is AB, and after the tax the new budget line is AB prime or AB slash. Now this new budget line represents the combinations of gasoline and all the other goods that the individual can afford right now. and the new equilibrium point is at point u1, which shows that now an individual is at equilibrium point e prime, and he would be consuming yt amount of all the other goods after the tax. T represents that tax has been implemented, and qt amount of gasoline over here. Now, if you see over here is that currently after the tax, the individual is purchasing YT amount of all the other goods, and that is represented by 0 YT, that is his expenditure on gasoline, and then AYT is the amount that he is purchasing gasoline. AYT represents the purchase of gasoline, and 0 YT represents the purchase of other goods. Now, issue over here is that if he increases the quantity of gasoline, then that reduces his amount available, his consumption available for consumption of all the other goods because of the tax also. So the tax over here is represented by for example, Y star represents the area, Y star T represents the area where this individual is being taxed, and that amount is to be considered, because if he increases his consumption of gasoline, then he would have lesser amount for consumption of all the other goods. Now let us assume the implementation of a lump sum tax. Now this lump sum tax would cause an income effect only. It won't affect the individual's behavior in terms of substitution, because it was affecting in terms of substitution, since the individual, when he increased the quantity of gasoline, he would not be considering only the price of gasoline but the tax on it also, and that would reduce his income available for all the other goods, because now gasoline is relatively expensive than all the other goods. So he have to take that into consideration. So now what if the budget line, if there is a lump sum tax is a general tax on an individual, and that won't be represented by that won't increase or decrease with the quantity of gasoline that he consumes or any other good that he consumes. So now his real income is less, so that would mean the budget line would shift parallel to the old budget line inwards towards the origin, which is represented by L and L slash over here. This budget line is parallel to the old budget line, which was AB, representing that his total income his real income has reduced in fact, and now he can afford less of all the goods, and because of this he can now increase the use of gasoline without having to fear of substitution, because there is no tax specifically related to the consumption of gasoline. So in this case he would move to the area, the utility curve U2, and his new point of equilibrium would be E prime prime, E double slash. So at this point he would be buying QL of the gasoline. He has increased his units of gasoline. So this all represents that the individual is much better off than before, because he is at a higher utility level than that was in the case of price distorting tax. So the lump sum tax represented by the T on the top left of y-axis is actually the lump sum tax, which has the amount according to which the budget line has shifted up, inwards from A to L and from B to L prime. So the individual is much better off in terms of this you can say lump sum tax, because now he can choose between gasoline and all the other goods without having to fear that relative price of gasoline is expensive and he has to substitute its consumption with some other good, and that was the substitution effect in previous case, and the individual is at a higher utility level considering that shift in, and he is no doubt consuming less of all the goods from his previous consumption because his income has decreased, but he does not have to substitute, because you can see he is consuming more gasoline now than in terms of price distorting tax, which was represented by QT, and QL represents the quantity of gasoline in terms of a lump sum tax. So now because gasoline is not relatively expensive to all the other goods, it's just the income effect, his total income has reduced, so he can only he has increased his consumption of QL considering the scenario of price distorting tax. So the individual's utility level declines in terms of price distorting tax, and if he is much better off if there is a lump sum tax, because you saw that his initial utility level was U3, it dropped down to U1 in presence of a price distorting tax. There seems to be a mistake on the slide. It shouldn't be price distorting subsidy, it should be price distorting tax. And then after a lump sum tax, the individual is better off, because now he is getting for example to a utility level U2. Now there is no substitution effect in terms of why the individual is better off and he moves to utility level U2, and he turns back to using more of gasoline instead of substituting it for other good, because there is no substitution effect. Since the product is not expensive relatively to the other goods, it is just the total level of income that has declined. I hope you understand the concept now of how price distorting tax might cause a substitution as well as income effect in terms of decrease in his real income for one good, and specifically for one good, because that good is expensive now, and then a substitution because that good is expensive, so he has to substitute and reduce his consumption. So since its consumption leads to more taxation, so he has to reduce the quantity and substitute it for the other good, which he did. And then if there is a lump sum tax, the whole income level declines, and that results into that individuals for example choices between the two goods only change. There is new considerations for, in terms of market, there would be new considerations for marginal social benefit and marginal social cost, just a new equilibrium point, but there is no substitution effect over there. Then another type of a tax is a unit tax. A unit tax adds to the price by a fixed amount. For example, 32 cents per pack of cigarettes or 24 cents per gallon of gasoline is a federal tax, for example. Now if these are the taxes, these are a unit tax, they are basically based on the units of the good produced, they are not or a percentage or anything else. If I buy 1 unit of certain good, then it would be the amount of tax I pay on that good, a fixed amount of tax, that would be a unit tax. There are often this sort of taxes in Pakistan also. The gross price is the price paid by the consumers basically. The net price is the price received by the producers after the tax is paid. Now this unit tax is basically on the product. I would pay the whole price. For example, a pack of cigarettes is, for example, 100 rupees, and 5 rupees is a tax on that, a unit tax on every pack of cigarette. So if I buy a pack of cigarette worth 100 rupees, then I would be paying 100 rupees. That would be gross price of the product. The supplier would be getting 95 rupees. That would be the net price of the product, while the 5 rupees is the tax which is going to the government. Now impact of a unit tax on market equilibrium, we would consider a unit tax on gasoline, and what would happen to that scenario in terms of market. The supply curve would shift left, showing increased price at the existing demand curve. The marginal social cost now includes a tax in it, and there is excess burden created. Now let's see how that happens. This is a market efficiency that we are discussing right now, how a unit tax, for example, might distort the market equilibrium. Now on the x-axis there is the gasoline number in terms of quantity, gasoline per year in gallons basically, and on y-axis its prices in terms of dollars, for example. Now there is a demand curve which is marginal social benefit curve, and there is a supply curve which is a marginal social cost curve also. Now consider, for example, the initial demand curve without any tax. Now what is happening over here is the demand curve and the supply curve are intersecting at point B, and the quantity demanded is Q star, which is the equilibrium quantity, and equilibrium price is $1. Now let's stay focused on this for now. The first graph is that I explained. There is a downward sloping demand curve. The downward sloping demand curve represents that with increase in prices I consume less, and with decrease in prices I consume more. That is basically the law of demand, the relationship between price and quantity. This demand curve is also the marginal social benefit curve. That's the benefit including external and for example private that I derive, the sum of private and external benefit that I derive from the use of that product. Now then there is S is equal to MSC, representing that supply is equal to marginal social cost, and this supply curve sloping upward represents that at higher prices, at higher quantity, prices would be charged would be higher, and at lower quantity, less price would be charged. Or in other words, at higher prices they would be willing to supply more, and at lower prices they would be willing to supply less. Now this is also a marginal social cost curve. Now their point of intersection is the equilibrium point, which is represented by B over here, and at that equilibrium point, Q star is the quantity that is being demanded, while $1 is the price that is being charged. Now these two lines that I just asked you to imagine out of this whole graph are the point of where marginal social benefit is equal to marginal social cost, and secondly is the equilibrium quantity when marginal social benefit and marginal social cost are equal to each other, and it is also without any government intervention right now. There is no unit tax or anything by the government. Now let us assume for now that there is a unit tax also, and government is charging 25 cents, for example, $0.25 as a unit tax on this, for example, per gallon. So if that unit tax is per gallon, that would mean that with every gallon I would be paying 0.25 to the government. Now what happens over here is, can you just imagine that if there is a unit tax on the product, that would mean that the product is more expensive for me, and now I have to, first I had to pay $1, now I had to pay $1.25. Now where the burden would go, whether the burden would go to the seller or whether the burden would go to supply or the consumer. Now let us look at this. The supply curve at a higher price would shift upwards. Actually now the supply curve is shifting because the cost of tax is actually included in the price of the product, so the supply curve would shift. The product is more expensive, and it is a unit tax. So this amount, for example, there is as I said, there is a gross price and there is a net price, and gross price is the price that I would be paying, net price would be the price that seller would be paying, and their difference is the tax that is being collected by the government in terms of their revenue. Now what is happening in the market is that supply curve shifts upward, and there is a new equilibrium point at representing representing point C, and at that point, for example, there is the quantity demanded would reduce because now the price is expensive, so the price is 1.15 per gallon, and that is represented by gross price, and that price is what I would be paying. Now since the supply curve has found a new intersection point with the demand curve, now in this case marginal social cost also includes the tax amount that is to be paid, so the supply curve would shift upwards. Since tax is a part of marginal social cost now, so there is a higher marginal social cost now, so supply curve is shifting upwards, and it finds a new point of intersection or equilibrium point with the existing demand curve. And as we said that in terms of the existing demand curve, when prices are higher, the quantity would reduce. So now the price has increased to the new equilibrium price has increased to $1.15, and the quantity has reduced to Q1 in a sense of Q1 gallons per year. So now PG is the gross price, which is the price that we would be paying, is $1.15. Now what would be the sellers getting in fact, because they would be getting $0.9 because rest of the amount, that 0.25 cents, would be taken out by the government. That is represented by a line at point from the equilibrium point going down to point A, and that is $0.90, which is the net price, and that is the price which would be received by the suppliers as such. And the remaining amount, the difference between $1.15 and 0.90, that the 1.15 that we are paying and 0.90 that they are receiving, the difference is 0.25 cents. That would be taken away by the government in terms of the tax revenue. Now I hope you are still with me and you are looking at this graph instead of running away to hide behind something that there is a difficult or complicated thing. It is just common sense. Like if there is a product, there is an equilibrium point at which people and consumers and producers have agreed that this is the quantity at which we would be willing to buy and they would be willing to supply, and there would be at any given price. Now let that price be $1 over here in this scenario. Now that equilibrium price and quantity would be the equilibrium point and would be the market efficient point where marginal social benefit is equal to marginal social cost. So that is represented by Q star over here. Normally we represent equilibrium price by P star, but we have written a number over here to make it easier, that is $1. So that is the equilibrium point decided. Now, whenever something shifts the demand curve or the supply curve, there is new equilibrium point to be defined. So in this case, a foreign action, when that takes place because of changes in supply and demand, there is movement on the supply curve or on the demand curve. But whenever something outside this scenario that cannot be considered in this two-axis plane, when that distorts the market, that affects the market, the supply curve, if that thing is hitting from the cost perspective, then the supply curve would shift. If that thing is hitting from, for example, income perspective or any other consumption perspective, the demand curve would shift. For example, if my income was reduced, then demand curve would shift inwards. For example, my income would increase, the demand curve would shift outwards. In the same sense, if cost of production increases, the demand curve, the supply curve would shift upwards, representing reduction in quantity demanded, quantity supplied. And if cost of production due to new technology goes down, then supply curve would shift downwards or towards the right, showing that the quantity supplied is being increased at the new reduced price. So in this scenario, actually the government unit tax is increasing the total cost of that product being supplied. So the supply curve would shift upwards, representing a reduction in the quantity. So that is being represented by the new equilibrium point, point C. Now, why are we focusing on point C? Because that is the point which I would be paying. Now, since the price has increased, so I would be demanding less. Now, since I am demanding less, then the new quantity being demanded is Q1. So that would mean that at increased price, the law of demand is still holding, and that says that with increased price, people would demand less, and this is what exactly happened over here. Now, the issue arises when that increased price won't go as a complete whole to the supplier. It would be only some part of it would go to the supplier, because that increased price was increased because of tax. So we would deduct 0.25 out of it. That would be taken by the government, 25 cents, and the rest of the 90 cents out of that $1.15 would go to the supplier. So that is why there is an excess burden over here, because there are decreased revenue for the supplier for no obvious reason over here. Just the tax has been implied, that is fine. That amount is being taken away by the government as revenue, but then only the area PG starting from the gross price going towards C, then coming down to A, and then going back to PN is being taken by the government in terms of revenue. So what happens to the reduced quantity that is being represented by the triangle ABC? Now that triangle ABC represents the deadweight loss, in a sense that there is a new income distribution taking place, because the seller's revenue has reduced. He had offered a price previously at which I was willing to buy a quantity Q1, but not because of his actions the price has increased, and that has resulted into decrease in quantity. And since he is getting, previously he was getting $1 for a higher quantity, now he is getting 90 cents for a lesser quantity, so he is not better off. In fact, he is getting less amount of revenue. Plus I was paying $1 previously, now I am paying $1.5, so I have to reduce my quantity. Do you see the difference over here? It is the seller basically who is getting the rest amount of revenue, because decrease in quantity demanded caused by government tax, not by his actions or his own actions, or not by the choices of the consumers. They are choices of the consumer, but actually the actions of the government lead to those choices of the consumers. So at $1 he was getting a higher quantity. In fact, now he is getting less amount. Logically, for less price he should be getting higher quantity. That is the law of supply and law of demand. But in this case, because of government action, there is reduced quantity as well as low price that that is going into his pocket. So that is basically the excess burden over here, is that the amount that is neither my benefit as a consumer, nor neither a supplier's benefit as a supplier, nor the government's benefit. It is a social loss to the society. So it is basically the excess burden represented by the triangle ABC over here, and that distortion has been created by the government. So that is the deadweight loss. Now there are methods to calculate the deadweight loss. It is represented by half times into the tax into change in quantity. The tax has caused a reduction in the quantity. Tax is like 0.25 cents over here, 0.25 cents, and when multiplied by change in quantity, that would be the deadweight loss. If if we the deadweight loss or excess burden of a unit tax actually is directly associated to elasticity of demand and elasticity of supply. Now, if we use that to, we can also derive this sort of expression that is being displayed on the screen below the big equation. It is basically half into tax square into equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price that were decided previously, multiplied by elasticity of supply into elasticity of demand, divided by elasticity of supply minus elasticity of demand. We would look at elasticities in very soon, in either in this lecture or in next lecture, because the amount tax actually affects the products differently based on their elasticities. I hope you understand what is elasticity of demand and elasticity of supply. Those are very basic concepts pertaining to economics, but I'm still not sure how many microeconomic courses have you taken, so let me narrate those elasticities once. Let us consider the elasticity of demand. Elasticity of supply would be exactly the similar thing in terms of supply side, but I would narrate that also, I guess. Elasticity of demand is the percentage change in quantity demanded due to percentage change in supply. Now, when we assume that it is, in other words, the responsiveness of quantity demanded to changes in prices. Now, when price of a product is changed, everybody knows that law of demand says that there is a negative relationship between price and quantity. So when price is increased, the quantity would decrease. But the question is by how much, and that is explained by the elasticity of demand. Now, demand can be elastic, the demand can be inelastic. Elastic demand would mean that when price is changed a little bit, either increased or decreased, the quantity demanded would change a lot. That would be elastic demand. And automatically that if I could express the formula over here is, if you write percentage change in quantity on the numerator and percentage change in price on the denominator, so if smaller changes in terms of prices cause huge changes in quantity, which is numerator, then that demand is said to be elastic. Change in both direction, either price increase or decrease, that does not matter, but it would be elastic as long as small changes in prices cause large changes in quantity. Those would be elastic. Now, inelastic would be when huge changes in prices cause very small changes in quantity, and that is inelastic demand. And this is you can use the similar terminologies, but in terms of supply also. Now, what would be elastic demand? For example, demand for recursion, demand for example an entertainment trip to Dubai. Now, in that case, if it is an entertainment trip, if prices increase, I can postpone that trip, so there would be lesser demand for that. But then the demand would fluctuate a lot with changes in prices, or maybe expensive cars and all the luxury goods are elastic basically. Then all the necessities are inelastic. If prices of flour or if prices of cooking oil increase a lot, then there is less effect on the quantity demanded. So that would mean that they are inelastic, in other words. Then on the other side, there is elasticity of supply. That would again be with changes in price, how much quantity supplied would be affected. You just replace the word supply with the demand word that I have been previously using, and there would be goods, because the prices would again be dependent on the inputs, because supply curve would be shifting by actions of the government or changes in prices of inputs. And if certain changes in prices of the product actually causes a huge change in quantity supplied, then it would be elastic supply. And if there is less change in for example quantity supplied, then it would be inelastic supply. So having explained that out of the context, I mean, I guess, but those words are being used over here, so I just need to be careful that you know the concept of elasticity of demand and elasticity of supply, and they are very much related to taxation also, because the efficient taxation that I'm going to discuss later on, I just give a hint why I explained those, because efficient taxation would be, I hope you remember when we discussed that taxes that are efficient are not always equitable. Then whenever the demand is inelastic, it pays you more to tax that product more. So in that sense, if for example that would automatically mean that flour and vegetable oil and rice and all the necessities would be taxed at a higher rate rather than all the luxuries. So that is efficient in terms of taxation, because that creates a less excess burden. They are efficient, but then in other sense they would be not equitable, and they would be challenged by people on the grounds of fairness. We would discuss that in a few minutes, I guess, or in very soon. Don't worry, maybe in the next lecture. Don't be too hasty. So implication of dead weight loss calculation: a doubling of the per unit tax quadruples the dead weight loss. That would mean that if we increase the tax from 2.5 to 0.50, we double the tax, then the area of excess burden would increase a lot. In the same graph we can show that, but we don't need to, we just express that in words. I've said that. So just keep it as take a given. Now, even if the revenue collected is returned to the supplier, the most implication, the biggest implication, that is that if the revenue collected is returned to the supplier and the seller, then dead weight loss cannot be removed. You see, the dead weight loss has been created. It has been created. It was there. So even if you pay back the revenue, if the government plans, okay, they suddenly decide that that was not right, we should pay back the 0.25 unit tax that we have collected from all the gasoline suppliers, and we would return that money immediately. They go and return that money, but that won't eliminate the dead weight loss that was created. That is why it is called dead weight loss to the society. It is a dead weight loss. It has occurred and it cannot be removed. Now this is the implication of dead weight loss, and that's why so many economists have devoted to actually calculating the dead weight losses of various taxations and various government incentives actions in terms of subsidies and in terms of taxation also. So that is why, like in this course, I have been discussing dead weight losses and excess burdens a lot in terms of subsidies, in terms of medical care, in terms of subsidies to the farmers, in terms of for example subsidies in terms of housing, because once a dead weight loss is created, that loss to the society, that you can say that blank space which was benefit to no one, either to the beneficiary of a subsidy or to the taxpayers, that space is over there, and that is not going to go away by payment of that money back. And in other sense, for example, that space in this example that we discussed would still be there, even if because that went nowhere. Neither it went to the government, nor it went to supplier, and not it went to consumer. It went from consumer's pocket to the government, and consumer reduced their consumption, and supplier got a less amount in terms of and quantity, and that quantity cannot be brought back. What has happened, and it cannot be changed in terms of dead weight loss. Now I was discussing in terms of elastic demand and elastic supply. If you look over here, is that excess burden is zero when demand or supply is perfectly inelastic. Now what is inelastic? Inelastic would mean for example, if you look at panel A, there is these are general demand curves, not specific to any scenario. Now in panel A, on panel B, on the x-axis there is quantity demanded of the product, and on the y-axis there is a price being charged of the product. And in panel A there is an inelastic demand curve, and on panel B there is inelastic supply curve. Now inelastic demand curve represents a straight line parallel to y-axis, and it is being called inelastic, that if you see that the quantity demanded, which is represented by small q over here, would remain the same no matter what the price is. So even if you change the price drastically along the y-axis, the quantity demanded would remain the same. So that is why it is a perfectly elastic demand curve. Now let's assume that maybe in terms of Pakistan's culture, maybe flour and rice that we eat a lot are very close to being inelastic, but still they are not perfectly inelastic, because perfectly inelastic won't change at all. Even if you change the prices of flour, people would reduce their consumption, but not to a greater extent. Even if you change the prices of for example rice, then its demand would change, but not by that much. So the whole point is that perfectly inelastic demand curve would be a straight line parallel to y-axis, and its quantity won't be affected by changes in prices. So if you tax that, if you put a tax on that, then supply would decrease, right? And in fact the supply they would try to reduce the supply, but they cannot reduce the supply because demand is inelastic. So the supply curve would shift upwards, representing a new equilibrium point. I'm discussing about panel A right now. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. I assume that since we were discussing the inelastic demand curve, you automatically look at panel A on the screen. So if you look at panel A on the screen, there is an initial supply curve. Consider the gasoline example again. If there is a tax on that product, then the supply curve would shift upwards. Then the supply curve would shift upwards. There would be a new equilibrium point and a higher price that is being charged, but the quantity is not being reduced. So that would mean that the demand curve is inelastic and there is no excess burden being created over here. No excess burden over here. So all the revenue, there is no shaded triangles. You can see if the two lines before the point of equilibrium before tax is going straight to the price y-axis, and after the tax the supply curve has shifted upwards, but the price line is going again to you can say y-axis, and there is no triangle being shaded over here. It is a two straight lines, and all the amount would be collected by the government as a revenue, so there is no excess burden to it. So that is why I previously said that it would be efficient to tax all the products whose demands are rather inelastic. For example, medical services, for example, polio vaccinations, for example, maybe flour and clothing and necessary food items or milk and all those products which are necessities of life. So if those products are necessities of life, they can be taxed and without any excess burden to the society. But that would be an efficient method of taxation. But do you think that would be equitable? I leave the answer to you. You should answer that. But still, going out to panel B, this is again being represented a demand curve and a supply curve. Now in this case the supply curve is inelastic. The supply is going to be there for that product and it cannot be changed in that given period, and it is represented by small q over here and then there is a demand curve which is was demanded before, and after there is a tax, a unit tax, then there is the net price after the tax. We saw that there would be reduction in quantity demanded. So demand curve in this case, because supply curve cannot shift, so demand curve would shift inwards, and there would be a reduction in the in terms of price in terms of that. But then there is net price of that product would be less, but then the point is there is no reduction in the quantity and there is no excess burden in this case also. So moving on about regarding the deadweight loss, efficiency to loss ratio of a tax can be calculated as deadweight loss per dollar of the revenue raised. So whenever there is a tax, the government needs to consider the deadweight loss per dollar. Like if this amount is for example 0.2, the ratio is deadweight loss to the efficiency loss ratio is 0.2, then that would mean that for every dollar raised by the government in terms of revenues, there is a 20 cents of excess burden that is being created. So these ratios are very important, and these are the estimates of basically efficiency loss ratios. These efficiency loss ratios can also be used to see different types of taxes which would generate, if there are like 2-3 options for the government, and what type of tax can be implemented, and the total amount of revenue that being generated is same. So they can always use those taxes which have minimal efficiency loss ratio. In other words, we discussed in terms of efficiency that they try to get the most efficient taxes which keep the excess burden to the minimum. So that would be efficiency loss ratio, or deadweight loss times divided by R, that how much deadweight loss or excess burden is originated due to $1 of revenue. So that would be an ideal scenario to judge what type of a tax to implement, and how we can as a government we can get more revenue by reducing the excess burden to the society. Now after having gone through this, I guess we are out of time right now, and it is necessary that we might summarize this whole lecture once, and then we call it a day. Now, basically, we started with the lump sum taxes today, and lump sum taxes, I said that they are not subject to some evaluation, or they are not subject to some specific income or consumption or wealth of an individual, and they are just an amount that an individual would pay, and they would not be associated to any type of consumption or level of income. So moving on, then we discussed that inefficiency in taxation and lump sum. We were comparing the two, and I specifically highlighted, we can highlight that in terms of that example again that we discussed in terms of price distorting tax, that if there is a tax, then tax would have an income effect as well as a substitution effect, a price distorting tax. For example, in this scenario we discussed that there is gasoline on x-axis and consumption of all the other goods by the individual on y-axis. So the budget line, initial budget line was AB, and the point of equilibrium was E on U2. If there is a price distorting tax, that would mean that it on gasoline, for example, that would mean it would make gasoline expensive, relatively expensive to all the other goods. So the budget line would move inwards and he would find a new point of equilibrium, but that would not be only the income effect because his real income has reduced, but that also include the substitution effect inside it, because now the gasoline is relatively expensive and individual would have to substitute for that also, so that causes an inefficiency. And if the same, we discussed that if the same could have been achieved by a price distorting tax, and the same could have been achieved by a lump sum tax, but the individual would be much better off, because in that case the budget line would shift inwards, representing a decrease in real income, and then he would be much better off, because now the gasoline is not relatively expensive to all the other goods. The products are, all of them are relatively less affordable without any comparison within them. So the individual would be at the utility level U3 and he would be much better off. Now this was specifically because in case of lump sum tax there was no substitution effect. Then we discussed a unit tax. Unit tax is a fixed amount, for example, that is being charged on consumption of a certain product, for example, like 32 cents per pack of a cigarette. If I purchase one pack of cigarette, it would be 32 cents that I have to pay over it. Then certain tax terminologies like gross price is the price that paid by the consumers, net price is the price that is received by the sellers, and the difference between them is actually the tax revenue that is collected by the government. Now we needed to discuss the impact of unit tax on the market equilibrium specifically. For example, we again considered a gasoline market, and we discussed that the initial point of equilibrium was represented by B over here, and as soon as there is a tax by the government, a unit tax, the supply curve shift upwards to the left, and that shows that the supply has decreased, and it would be the supply is going to be more expensive, and the price for the product, which is in terms of gross price, has increased. Now the government has applied a 0.25 cents unit tax on the product, and because of that, now the price that I have to face in terms of gross price, that would be greater than the previous price, which was equilibrium price was $1. Now I have to pay $1.15, and the price received by the amount received by the sellers is only $0.90, that is 90 cents. So the difference of $0.25 goes to the government. Now we discussed over here is that you see that the price has increased for me, the gross price, and the net price is decreased for the seller, and that is why there is a net loss, and there is a redistribution of income in a sense that now he would be getting a lesser revenue because he was getting a higher price for a higher quantity for $1, and now he is getting only 90 cents, and the quantity has also reduced, so he would be getting less amount of revenue. Then we discussed the excess burden or the deadweight loss, and we discussed the formula for that, and I explained the concept of that. They are related to elasticity of demand and supply, and I explained the concept of elasticity of demand and supply. Elasticity of demand is the responsiveness of quantity demanded to change in prices, and elasticity of supply is responsiveness of quantity supplied to change in prices of the product. And we discussed over here is that excess burden is zero when the demand is perfectly elastic, or the supply is demand is perfectly inelastic and supply is perfectly inelastic. Whenever they are inelastic, they are parallel to y-axis. When they are perfectly elastic, they are parallel to x-axis. We would discuss those scenarios also. We have discussed those before, by the way. So basically whenever there is a change in for example net price or the gross price, and there is a unit tax by the government and supply curve shifts or the demand curve shifts in panel B, then there is no excess burden being created, because in panel A the demand curve is perfectly inelastic, and on panel B the supply curve is perfectly inelastic. And secondly, one thing I guess I missed over here is that I also discussed that deadweight loss has a very severe implication, and that is that if the government decides to return all the tax collections to the payers, for in our gasoline example, if they decide to pay it back to the gasoline suppliers, then the deadweight loss still cannot be removed, but because that event has taken place and deadweight loss was created, and that cannot be removed by giving them that amount, because quantity was also reduced and there is a loss to the society. And then I mentioned the efficiency loss ratio, that would be deadweight loss divided by the total revenue collected. That would automatically mean that what is the amount of excess burden on the society for $1 of revenue collected. And I said that policymakers can use this efficiency loss ratio to decide that if the certain amount of revenue is to be collected, then what would be the best source, because they need to reduce the amount of excess burden to the society, and they would choose the efficiency loss ratio which would have the most minimum value in this sense. Hope to see you in the next lecture. We would continue this discussion in terms of evaluating various actions by the government like taxes on the economy. We would be discussing this further. Hope to see you again. Take care. Allah Hafiz.